Chapter 13. The summer was over at last, and nobody could deny any longer that the autumn was definitely there. It was that rather sad time of year when, for the first time for many months, the fine old sun still blazes away in a cloudless sky, but does not warm you, and hoar-frosts and the mists and the winds begin to stir their faint limbs at morning and evening with the gossamer, as the sap of winter vigor remembers itself, in the cold corpses which brave summer slew. The leaves were still on the trees, and still green, but it was the leaden green of old leaves, which have seen much since the gay colours and happiness of spring. That seems so lately, and, like all happy things, so quickly to have passed. The sheep fairs had been held, the plums had tumbled off the trees in the first big winds, and here and there, in the lovely sunlight too soon enfeebled, a branch of beech or oak was turning yellow, the one to die quickly and mercifully, the other perhaps to hold grimly to the frozen tree, and to hiss with its papery skeletons all through the east winds of winter until the spring was there again. The wart's arm did not hurt any more, but he was not allowed to do his martial exercises under the sergeant at arms in the afternoons, for fear of spoiling it before it was properly mended. He went for walks instead, kept watch on a playful family of 5 hobbies, who shouted cooey, 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 and would be migrating any day now. They were late already, and he collected the enormous caterpillars of moths, which had been through all their changes and now sought lumberingly for a convenient place in which to turn into the chrysalis. His best capture was the 4-inch plum and apricot upholstery of a goat moth, which buried itself quite cheerfully among trails of silk in a box of loose earth which he kept beside his bed. It had taken 3 years to reach its present size, and would lie perdu for another before the big dun moth crept out of its old armor and pumped the blood into the veins of its expanding wings. Merlin caught a male grass snake on one of these walks. They met by chance, face to face, as each was turning the corner of a big bed of seeded nettles from opposite directions, and the magician pounced upon the reptile before it had time to flick its black tongue twice. He held it up, wriggling, hissing, and smelling strongly of acetylene, while the wart examined it in horror. "Don't be afraid of it," said Merlin. "It is only a piece of olive lightning with an ochre V behind its shining black head. It can't sting you and won't bite you. It has never done harm to anybody and can only flee and stink. See," he said, and began stroking it from the head downwards, a touch which the poor creature tried to evade, but soon accepted, in its ceaseless efforts to pore and pore away. "Everybody kills them," said Merlin indignantly. "Some by Our Lady fool once said that you could tell an adder because it had a V on its head, which stood for viper. It would take you 5 minutes to find the mark on an adder's head anyway, but these helpless beauties with their bright yellow black bordered V get bashed to death in consequence. Here, catch hold of him." The wart took the serpent gingerly into his hands, taking care to hold it well away from the vent from which the white smell came. He had thought that snakes were slimy as well as dangerous, but this was not. It was dry as a piece of living rope, and had, like rope, a pleasing texture to the fingers on account of its scales. Every ounce of it was muscle, every plate of its belly was a strong moving foot. He had held toads before, and they, the fat, philosophical, warty creatures, had been a little clammy on account of their loose flesh. This creature, on the other hand, was dry and delicately rough and liquid power. It was the same temperature as the ground on which it basked. "You asked to be turned into a snake once," said Merlin. "Do you still want that?" "Yes, please." "It isn't much of a life, I don't think you'll get anything very exciting happening, do you? This chap probably only eats about once a week or once a fortnight, and the rest of the time he dreams. Still, if I turned you into one, you might get him to talk. It won't be more than that.
I should like it all the same.
Well, it will be a rest after shooting anthropophagy.
Merlin loosed the grass snake, which immediately flashed off into the nettles. Then he exchanged a few words in Greek with an invisible gentleman called Aesculapius and turned to the wart. He said,
I shall stay here for an hour or two, and perhaps I shall sit down against that tree and have a nap. Then I want you to come out to me when I call you. Goodbye.
The wart tried to say goodbye, but found that he was dumb. He looked quickly at his hands, but they were not there. Aesculapius had accepted him so gently that he had not noticed it, and he was lying on the ground.
Pour off, then, said Merlin. Go and search for him in the nettles.
Some people say that snakes are deaf, and others that they deafen themselves in order to escape being charmed by music. The thoughtful adder, for instance, is said by many learned persons to lay one ear upon the ground and to stick the point of his tail into the other so that he cannot hear your music. Wart found that as a matter of fact, snakes were not deaf. He had an ear, anyway, which was conscious of deep roaring sounds that were approximate to the noises which he had learned as a boy. For instance, if somebody bangs on the side of the bath, or if the pipes begin to gurgle when your ears are under water, you hear sounds which are different to those which would be heard in a normal position. But you would soon get accustomed to these sounds and connect the roaring and bumbling with water pipes, if you kept your head under water for long. In fact, although you heard a different kind of noise, you would still be hearing the pipes which human beings hear in the upper air. So the wart could hear what Merlin said, though it sounded very thin and high, and he therefore hoped to be able to talk to the snake. He darted out his tongue, which he used as a sort of feeler, such as the long stick with which an explorer might probe the bogs in front of him, and he slid off into the nettles in search of his companion. The other snake was lying flat on its face in a state of great agitation. It had managed to push itself into the very roots of the coarse grass among the nettles, for there is always a kind of empty layer between the green grass and the actual mud. The top green layer is supported on pillars of bleached roots, and it was in this secret acre-huge chamber, which covers every grass field, floored with mud and roofed with green, that the poor snake had sought concealment. It was lamenting to itself in a very sweet, cold, simple voice, crying, "Alas! Alas!" It is difficult to explain the way in which snakes talk, except by this. Everybody knows that there are rays of light, the infrared and the ultraviolet, and those beyond them, in which ants, for instance, can see and men cannot. Just so, there are waves of sound higher than the bat's squeak, which Mozart once heard delivered by Lucrezia Agigari in 1770, and lower than the distant thunder which pheasants hear, or is it that they see the flash, before man? It was in these profound melodious accents that the snake conversed. "Who are you?" asked the snake, trembling, as Wart poured himself into the secret chamber beside it. "Did you see the human? It was an H. sapiens, I believe. I only just got away." It was in such a flutter that it did not wait for its question to be answered, but went on excitedly. "Oh, the horrid creature! Did you notice how it smelt? Well, I shan't go out again in a hurry, that I will say. Look what a mess I have got myself in. It was an H. sapiens barbatus, as far as I could see. They are quite common round here.
you take my advice and lie close for a day or two. I just went out for a moment with the idea of getting a frog or two before hibernating, and it pounced on me like a hedgehog. I don't believe I was ever so frightened in my life. Do you think it would be best to hibernate at once?" "I shouldn't worry," said the wart. "That particular human is fond of snakes, as I happen to know." "To to eat?" stammered the serpent. "No, no, he is friendly with them, and has some as pets. That is, he spends most of the botany hours looking for frogs to feed them on. It's wonderful how few frogs there are once you begin looking for them. Only toads, and of course snakes don't eat toads." "I ate a toad once," said the other, who was beginning to calm down. "It was a small one, you know, but it wasn't very nice. Still, I don't think I should like to be a pet of that creature's, however many frogs it caught. Do you happen to know its sex?" "It was a male," said the wart. "H. sapiens barbatus male," repeated the snake, feeling safer now that he had got the subject classified. "And what is your name, my child?" The wart did not know what to answer, so he simply told the truth. "It's a funny sort of name," said the snake doubtfully. "What is yours?" asked the wart. "T. natrix." "Does the T stand for anything?" "Well, not Tommy," said the snake rather coolly. "If that's what you mean, it's Tropidonotus in my family, always." "I'm sorry." "If you don't mind my saying so," remarked the snake, "it seems to me that your education has been neglected. First, you have a mother who calls you wart, just as if you were one of those vulgar buffonidae. Then you can't distinguish a T. natrix when you see him. Do you never have a mother?" "As a matter of fact, I didn't." "Oh, I'm sorry," exclaimed the snake. "I hope I haven't hurt your feelings. Do you mean to say you never had anybody to teach you the legends and dreams and that?" "Never." "You poor newt! What do you do then when you hibernate?" "I suppose I just go to sleep." "And not dream?" "No," said the wart. "I don't think so. Not much." It turned out that T. natrix was an affectionate and tender-hearted creature, for it now shed a small clear tear through its nose, and exclaimed indignantly, "What a shame! Fancy the poor little reptile crawling into its lonely hole for all these months with not a mother to remember, and not a single dream to keep it company. I suppose they haven't even taught you history?" "I know some history," said the wart doubtfully, "about Alexander the Great and that." "Some trashy modern stuff, no doubt," said the snake. "How on earth you get through the winter, I don't know. Did anybody tell you about Atlantosaurus ammanus and Ceratosaurus nasicornis?" "I don't think so." "Well, I don't know what to say." "Couldn't you tell me about them yourself?" "It certainly seems the kindest thing to do," replied the snake. "And by Aesculapius, I will do it too, if it takes me all the afternoon. Why, I should hardly be able to sleep the whole winter thinking of you shivering in that hole with nothing to muse about." "It would be very kind of you, if you would." "And I will," said the gentle reptile. "I will teach you the sort of thing that all snakes revolve in their small, slow winter brains. evenings, what time the snow shuffles down outside, or for that matter in the summer too, as they snooze beside warm stones? Would you rather have history or legends? I think history, said the wart. History, murmured the snake, drawing a film over its eyes because it could not close them. History, it repeated softly. Ah, I wonder, said the snake after a minute. Then it gave a gentle sigh and gave it up. You must forget about us, it said absently. There is no history in me or you. We are individuals, too small for a great sea to care for. That is why I don't have any special name, but only T-Natrix, like all my forefathers before me. There is a little history in T-Natrix, but none in me. It stopped, baffled by its own feelings, and then began again in its slow voice. There is one thing which all we snakes remember, child, except for two people. We are the oldest in the world. Look at that ridiculous H. sapiens barbatus, which gave me such a fright just now. It was born when? 10 or 20,000 years ago. What do the 10s and 20s matter? The earth cooled. The sea covered it. It was 100 million years ago that life came to the great sea, and the fishes bred within it. They were the oldest people, the fish. Their children climbed out of it and stood upon the bosky shores, and they were the amphibia, like our friends the newts. The third people who sprang from them were the reptiles, of which we are one. Think of those old faces of the world upon which T-Natrix moved in the slime, and of the millions of years. Why, the birds which you see every day are our descendants. We are their parents, but can persist to live along with them. Do you mean that when you were born, there were no birds or men? No birds or men, no monkeys or reindeer or elephants or any such animals, only the amphibia and the reptiles and the fishes and the Mesozoic world. That's history, added the snake thoughtfully. One of those H. sapiens barbatus male might think of that the next time he murders T-Natrix for being a viper. There is something strange about the will of the sea. It is bound up with the history of my family. Did you ever hear the story of H. sapiens armatus Georgius Sanctus? I don't think I did, said the wart. Once, very long ago, when even T-Natrix was young and hopeful, there were two families called Atlantosaurus amanus and Ceratosaurus nasicornis. Atlantosaurus was 115 feet long. He had not many brains, although I did hear once that he had something like an extra brain at the other end of him to take care of his tail. And he lived by browsing on the trees. He was timid, ruminant, and harmless, except to the tree frogs, which he munched by mistake among the boughs. He lived very long and thought all the time, so that, although he did not think very well, he had generally thought a good deal by the end of it. So far as I can remember, he had solved the problem of being a giant without breaking on account of his own weighty height of 20 feet by having his bones hollow. The birds do that too, you know, for other reasons. However, perhaps I'm muddling him up with another of the dinosauria. Ceratosaurus nasicornis was quite small. He was only 17 feet long, but he had teeth, great crushing and tearing teeth, which fitted into each other so badly that he leaped always with his slaughterous mouth half open in a grin of terror. He leaped like a kangaroo, a death-dealing kangaroo, and he generally leaped upon poor Atlantosaurus amanus. He had a horn upon his nose, like a rhinoceros, with which he could rip an opening into that big trundling old body, and his clashing teeth could meet in the flesh as in ripe fruit, and tear it into mouthfuls by the action of his muscular neck. What is more terrible, he leaped in packs. Ceratosaurus nasicornis was at war with Atlantosaurus amanus, in that strange war which the spirit of the waters wills, the war of competition and evolution, which makes the trees fight upwards for the sun on the Amazon, and in the course of which, for the boon of life, many of my cousins have been content to sacrifice the benefit of limbs and teeth and eyesight. Ceratosaurus was savage and aggressive, Atlantosaurus timid and old. Their combat lasted for as many centuries as will be needed by H. sapiens also, in which to destroy himself. At the end of that time, it was the defender who triumphed. The ferocious kangaroo had dealt death on every side, had decimated his adversaries, and fed upon their carcasses. But carcasses cannot continue their species, and in the end, the kangaroos had consumed the very flesh on which they lived. Too remorseless for the spirits of the waters, too bloodthirsty for the hierarchy of progressive victims, the last Ceratosaurus roamed the thick-leaved jungles in a vain search for the food which would satisfy his gnashing jaws, then died and slept with his fathers. The last Atlantosaurus thrust her 40-foot neck out of the jungle in which she had been hiding, and surveyed the emaciated corpse of her starved persecutor. She had preserved her life as the sensible wood pigeon does, by specializing in escape. She had learned to flee, to hide, to stand still, to control her scent, to conceal herself in waters. By humility, she had survived her enemy, who had slain her own husband, and now she carried the children of the latter inside her, the last of the victorious race. They would be born in a few years. H. sapiens had come meanwhile. He also had suffered from the terror of the kangaroo. In order to protect himself from its rapine, he had developed a subclass called H. sapiens armatus, a class which was concealed in metal scales and carried a lance by means of which it defended itself against the dinosauria. This subclass had perfected an order called H. sapiens armatus Georgius sanctus, which was sufficiently unobservant to classify all the dinosaurs together as its enemies. Atlantosaurus thrust out her neck and thought with triumph of her unborn children. She had never killed in her life, and these, the future, would perpetuate a vegetarian race. She heard the clink of H. sapiens armatus Georgius sanctus, and turned the comely reptile head towards him in her kindly curiosity. "Go on," said the ward. "He killed her, of course," concluded the serpent with sudden brevity, turning its own head away. "She was a reptile of my race." "I am so sorry," said the ward. "I don't know what to say." "There is nothing, dear," said the patient serpent, "that you can say. Perhaps I had better tell you a legend or dream to change the subject." The wart said, I don't think I want to hear it, if it is sad. There is nothing sad, said the other, except history. All these things are only something to muse upon while you are hibernating. It is a good thing to muse. Well, it passes the time. Even H. Sapiens has museums, you know, and as far as that goes, he has put the chalky bones of Atlantosaurus in many of them, along with the scales of Georgius Sanctus. If you knew a fairly cheerful legend, said the wart, I think I could bear to hear that. Ridiculous newt, said T. Natrix affectionately, for newt seemed to be one of his pet words. I suppose I shall have to tell you a legend of my dangerous cousins, for whom I suffer. Is it cheerful? Well, it just goes on to the end, you know, and then stops, as legends do. Tell it, said the wart. This legend, said the snake in its sing-song voice after a preparatory cough, comes from Burma, a place of which you have probably never heard. Once upon a time, there was only one poisonous serpent in the world, and this was the python. As you know, he is no longer venomous, and the story of how he lost his venom is an interesting one. In those days, he was perfectly white. He happened to make the acquaintance of the wife of a human being whose name was Aunt Ewe, and in course of time they fell in love with each other. Aunt Ewe left her husband and went off to live with the python, whose name was P. reticulatus. She was in some ways an old-fashioned kind of person, the kind which delights in making carpet slippers for curates among the humans, and she soon set about weaving a most handsome, closely woven skin for her python. It was an ornamental affair, what with black lozenges and yellow dots, and here and there, at regular intervals, cubes and cross stitches of amber, such as the humans use in rug making or working samplers. P. reticulatus was pleased with it, and wears it always, so that now he is not white any more. At this time, the python was interested in making experiments with his unique venom. Since he was the only poisonous snake, he naturally contained within himself all the poison which is nowadays spread out among the snakes. So concentrated was this terrible poison, therefore, that he could kill a man, however far away he was, simply by biting any footprint which the man had happened to leave on the ground. P. reticulatus was naturally proud of this accomplishment, but he could never get ocular proof of it. He could not be there to see the man die, and at the same time 3 or 4 miles away to bite his footprint. Yet he wanted very much to establish the truth of the experiment. One day, he decided that he would have to rely on evidence. He persuaded a crow that was a friend of his to go off to a village of the Karens. This was the name of the men in that district, and to watch and see if the man did die while he was biting the footprint. Now, the Karens had a curious habit of celebrating a death or funeral, not by tears and lamentations, but by laughing, singing, dancing, jumping, and beating on drums. When the crow arrived to watch events from a tree, and after the man had died, the Karens began to perform the usual rites in front of the hut in which he lay stricken. So the crow, after looking on for some time, returned to the python and reported that, so far from slaying by the venom of his bite, it had only the effect of causing extreme joy to human beings and of transporting them into the seventh heaven. The python was so furious that he climbed up to the very top of a tree and sicked up every ounce of his useless poison. Of course, the poison had to fall on something. Although the python had lost his power to sting, the tree itself became venomous, and its juice is used to this day by the anthropophagi to poison their arrows. While several creatures which happened to be underneath it received a due share. The cobra, the water snake, and the frog were among them. Now, Aunt Ewe naturally had a soft spot for her fellow mortals, and when it was discovered that the poison was venomous after all, she upbraided P. reticulatus for spreading the power to slay among so many beings. P. reticulatus, who was grateful for his woven coat, felt remorse for what he had done, and hurried off to see how he could improve matters. He explained the nature of the poison to all the creatures which had received it, and asked them to promise that their use of it should not be tyrannical. The cobra agreed to the remarks of the python, and said, "If there be transgression so as to dazzle my eyes, to make my tears fall 7 times in one day, I will bite, but only then." So said most of the kindlier creatures, but the water snake and the silly frog said that they did not see what all this had to do with the python, and that they intended, for their parts, to bite whenever they felt like it. The python immediately set upon them, chasing them into the water, and there, of course, the poison was dissolved and washed away. The wart waited to see if there was any more of this story, but there was not. The voice of T. Natrix had been getting slower and sleepier towards the end of it, for the afternoon was advancing and the wind was beginning to fall cold. The sing-song had seemed to get more and more wrapped up in its subject, if you can follow the idea, until it seemed that the story was telling itself while the serpent only drowsed, though it was not possible to tell whether he was really asleep, because snakes have no eyelids to close. "Thank you," said the wart. "I think that was a good story." "Dream about it," whispered T. Natrix sleepily, "while you hibernate." "I will. Good night," said the snake. "Good night." The funny thing was that the wart really did feel sleepy. Whether it was the voice of the snake, or the cold, or the influence of the story, in 2 minutes he was dreaming himself, in a reptilian dream. He was as old as the veins of the earth, which were serpents like him, and Aesculapius, with a beard as white as glaciers, was lulling him to sleep. He was teaching him wisdom, the ancient wisdom by which the old snakes can walk with 300 feet at once upon the same world in which their grandchildren, the birds, have learned to fly. He was singing to him the song of all the waters. In the great sea, the stars swing over, the eternal whirlpool flows. Rest, rest, wild head in the old bosom, which neither feels nor knows. She only rocks us, cradled in heaven, the reptile and the rose. Her waters which bore us will receive us. Good night and sweet repose. In the end, it took Merlin 20 shouts in his high human voice to wake the sleeping serpent up in time for tea.